Wolverine, easily one of Marvel's most recognizable characters.
Excuse me, I'm Eric Lensher.
Sounds Xavier.
There are so many great stories that Logan has starred in or been a part of, and as a result, a pretty substantial legacy has been built for this guy. I'm sure everybody has seen something with him in it, or at least referencing him. There's movies, comics, cartoons, video games, and so much more. So I wanted to compare two of Wolverine's most famous pieces of media: the movie Logan and the Old Man Logan comic book. The comic is a crazy odyssey set in an apocalyptic United States ruled by the villains of the Marvel Universe, and the movie is a slow-paced western about Wolverine and Xavier transporting a young mutant across the country. While the two of these may seem very different at face value, they have a lot more in common than you might think, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So with all that aside, let's get started. So instead of just going through the entire story like I did with The Doom That Came to Gotham, I'm just going to start with the similarities they have and then move on to the differences. So at face value, these stories are kind of similar. A Wolverine past his prime, living in seclusion away from a world that doesn't care for him after most of the heroes have died. Then he goes on a road trip across the country to deliver something important, and loses somebody close to him along the way. Both have nice bonding moments, both have a lot of Western themes and that overall aesthetic, and both see Logan struggling with himself. We'll be talking about that later. Those are really the only similarities I could find, and that's not a bad thing. I think it's cool to see how both of these are so great in spite of their differences. Actually, very early in production, the creator of the comic approached director James Mangold, saying that they could try to adapt the comic, but just switch out Hawkeye for Cyclops and Hulk for Blob, but I'm glad Mangold ended up doing it differently.
What's that supposed to be? You want to dance with me? Oh, that feels good. Hey, guess what?
Because I think something as bombastic and creative as the Old Man Logan comic needs to have access to the greater Marvel Universe to be properly executed. Now don't get me wrong, the X-Men, especially now, have an incredibly vast world with a lot to discover, but Old Man Logan does feel more like a Marvel apocalypse with a mutant as the main character, rather than an X-Men themed apocalypse. I think the best way I'd put it is the comic is more like Mad Max, and the movie is more like the beginning of Interstellar. Both of these also have deep character arcs for Logan, but I'll talk about him separately. So, diving into what these two did different, starting with Logan, this story feels so grounded in reality. I mean, obviously, there's a deranged elderly Canadian cutting people up, but otherwise, the world feels very much like the real world, which I think works really well with the fact that Wolverine's healing factor doesn't work like it used to, which adds tension to the action and plot. There's also a lack of superheroes in this movie, which makes sense for a few reasons. One, the movie doesn't have access to all the Marvel characters like the comic does. Two, most of the mutants that the movie could have used are most likely dead. And three, it adds to the realism to have fewer superpowered people in the movie. Characters with powers are there only because they fit with the plot. Because imagine the final fight scene in the woods, Logan is getting outnumbered, all hope seems lost, until Colossus comes out of nowhere, punches a bad guy, and says something like,
"No offense, American, but you need to aim a little better next time." Yeah!
The movie also puts a lot of focus on Laura and her development. She's a kid who got robbed of her childhood and was trained to be a killer, and we see that in how animalistic she acts in her fight scenes. But in her scenes with Logan, she gets to live a little and get a real father figure. Last thing, Xavier honestly gets really good characterization too.
The new Quesalupa from Taco Bell.
He's not as sharp as he used to be, but he still has a lot of his wisdom and does his best to help his loved ones. But he also carries a lot of sadness because it's heavily implied that he was the one who killed most of the X-Men in their world after having a telepathic seizure. That makes this story even sadder when you consider that this movie may quite possibly take place after Days of Future Past with the happy ending. I'm not sure if it actually is or not because continuity is a bit messy, but James Mangold did pitch Logan as a sequel, so if you want to consider that, then it adds a new layer. Oh, and just in case you didn't think this movie was a Western, the only time Xavier uses his powers, it's to calm down horses on the road. Contrastly, the Old Man Logan comic goes in so many crazy directions, it's basically Marvel's version of Fury Road. There's car chases, monsters, wasteland versions of the Marvel characters, and so much more. This version of the Marvel Universe is one where every single villain got together and attacked all of the heroes at once. We only ever see Logan's perspective, so we never really know how all of the other heroes were killed. There's just hints as to what happened, which is good because most of the time these heroes wipe the floor with their villains. But in the comic, you see Thor's hammer, the body of Giant Man.
Wait a minute!
Huh. All Rudd finally aged.
And the Red Skull has a trophy room full of old hero suits. There's also some dialogue about what happened. Apparently Thor was killed by Magneto, and some of the Fantastic Four were sent into another dimension. I mentioned that we only see Wolverine's perspective, and that's for a very specific reason. He checks the computer alongside Jubilee. They see distress calls from superhero groups across the entire world, until a massive group of villains breaks into the mansion. Logan tells Jubilee to go get the rest of the mutants out of there, as he fights off the villains, cutting through each and every one, leaving Bullseye as the last man standing. Logan kills him, and in his dying breath, Bullseye says that the two of them are supposed to be friends. Naturally, this confuses Logan, until Mysterio of all people pops out of the wreckage for the biggest plot twist in the story. So the sad truth is that Jake Gyllenhaal over here had cast an illusion to make Logan think that all of the X-Men were villains. That's right, he killed all of them. As punishment for this, Logan attempts to take his own life, which he obviously fails to do because he's immortal, but still. He then took up the life of a farmer, starting a family and becoming a pacifist, just going by Logan. One big issue with that, though. The Hulk is his landlord, and he can't pay rent. In fact, the entire country is ruled by villains now. Dr. Doom, Kingpin, and Red Skull all own different parts of the country, which is lawless and riddled with destruction. And in the wasteland in between, you got Ghost Rider biker gangs, venomized dinosaurs, and inbred Hulks. Like I said, Marvel's Fury Road. In my opinion, though, the best difference is how these two stories depict Logan himself. In both versions, Logan has a serious struggle that he goes through. Let's finish up the comic book talk here, and then we'll get back to the movie later. I mentioned earlier that Wolverine killed all of the X-Men with his bare hands, and when he did, he was mortified by it. He walked away into the woods. The animals that he once understood wanted nothing to do with him, and he tried to get run down by a train. After that night, he never used his claws again, and did his best to leave no traces of Wolverine behind. He became a pacifist, and we see how that impacts him on his journey. He gets beaten and battered by practically every villain he faces. Hawkeye practically has to do all the fighting, while Logan limits himself to driving the car. It takes Hawkeye's death and being shot to oblivion to finally at least fight back against Red Skull and kill him. And afterward, he doesn't stay to fight through the rest of the guards, he just does what he has to so he can escape in Iron Man's armor back to his family. But once he returns home, he finds that his family was murdered by the Hulks. The one thing that Logan cared about after the fall, the thing that he had come all this way for, was gone. And with that, Logan finally pops his claws and tells his neighbors to call him Wolverine. He's finally back, he's done running from who he really is, and he wants revenge. He cuts his way through all of the Hulk's lineage, slicing and carving like a madman until he reaches the big man himself. Just gonna take a second to say that the Hulk and Wolverine rivalry has lasted for decades. Wolverine's first appearance was in a Hulk comic, so to see these two, some of Marvel's strongest, old and gray, and about to fight is pretty cool. And if you're wondering why the Hulk is evil now, apparently exposure to gamma radiation over several decades affected his mind. Makes sense, I guess. Anyway, Wolverine gets eaten by the Hulk, and then bursts back out alien style. And then he takes off, ready to bring justice and order to the wasteland. Now that right there is a pretty darn good redemption story. While the movie is more about found family and finding inner peace. When we see Logan, he's old, angry, and by all means done with the world. This is set in 2029, and anti-mutant drugs have been put into consumer products like soda, chips, and even the drinking water. And as a result, Wolverine's healing factor is slowly failing, meaning the metal grafted to his skeleton is poisoning him, so he's living on borrowed time, and you can see that in Hugh Jackman's amazing performance. He's gotten far more gray, his claws are slower to come out, his healing factor is slower, his vision is failing, he's slowly dying. And all he's trying to do now is make as much money as possible to buy a boat so him and Charles can live off the rest of their days on the water. But then, he meets Laura, and at first he's reluctant to care for her, but with the encouragement of Charles and the arrival of the Reavers, he decides to bring her across the country to safety. Over the course of the movie, the three of them bond, Laura and Logan especially, as they learn to trust one another. The best scenes in this movie are honestly just the characters talking to each other. The dinner scene in particular might be my favorite moment in the film. Throughout the movie, Logan only gets closer and closer to death, and in the end, he finally does die, and it brings his character full circle. Now, the continuity of the X-Men movies is pretty stupid, but regardless of that, it's safe to say that because of his virtual immortality, Logan, in general, hasn't really gotten a chance to feel like part of a family. So in his final moments, he says this.
This is what it feels like.
Because he finally found a family. Laura even calls him Dad. And when he passes on, the kids bury him, and that's final. There's no tease at the end, no hints that he might still be alive. He's gone, and he's at peace, which is an amazing thing. So, what version is the best? Which Logan is better than the other? Well, you probably already saw this coming, but neither. Both of them are amazing in their own unique ways. Logan is an amazing movie with great acting, characters, and action. And Old Man Logan is an amazing comic book with all of the bombastic action and craziness that comes with a big Marvel story like that. So yeah, depending on what you're into, check out both. Both are incredibly violent and are intended for mature audiences, but hopefully that shouldn't hold you off for too long. And real quick, a few things. Stephen Merchant as Caliban is amazing, and please, 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 watch the trailer for Logan with the Johnny Cash Hurt cover in it, because even just that trailer itself is amazing. And with that, we've reached the end of today's video. Thank you for watching, I hope you found it entertaining and informative. Be sure to like and subscribe to see more just like it, and I'll see you nerds later.
Tell me why it ain't nothing but a holiday. Tell me why it ain't nothing but a mistake. Tell me why I never wanna